The day I lost everything over nothing. There is a specific Tuesday I think about more than I probably should. I was 34 years old, sitting in the parking lot of a grocery store in suburban Ohio, and I was shaking. Not because anything catastrophic had happened. No one had died. I hadn't lost my job. My kids were fine. What had happened was this. A man in a blue sedan had taken the parking spot I was waiting for, looked me directly in the eyes through the windshield, and shrugged. That shrug. I sat there for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 because I watched the clock on my dashboard like it was evidence. My heart was hammering. My jaw was clenched so tight I'd later find out I'd cracked a back molar. I was rehearsing, in vivid detail, everything I should have said. Everything I would have said if I were a different kind of man. I was furious at him. Furious at myself for not confronting him. Furious at my wife who wasn't even there for some imagined crime of not understanding how disrespected I felt on a daily basis. By the time I walked into the store, I had mentally ruined my entire evening, preloaded a fight that hadn't happened yet, and decided, somewhere in the back of my mind, that people were fundamentally selfish and that I was surrounded by them, over a parking spot, over a shrug from a stranger I would never see again. I tell you this not because it's a particularly dramatic story. I tell you this because it's embarrassingly ordinary. Because, if I describe this to most people, the racing pulse, the rehearsed confrontations, the slow poison of replayed grievances, they would nod with recognition before I even finished the sentence. We have all been that person in the parking lot. We have all handed the keys to our emotional state to someone who didn't even know they were holding them. What I didn't understand that Tuesday, and what took me years of real work to learn, is that the man in the blue sedan had nothing to do with my suffering. He was a stranger executing a mild act of rudeness in a parking lot. He forgot about it before he reached the produce section. I carried it for 3 days. The suffering was mine. The mechanism that generated it was mine. And crucially, the ability to dismantle that mechanism was mine too. That is what this audiobook is about. Not about becoming cold. Not about pretending that rude people don't exist, or that injustice doesn't sting. Not about performing some theatrical calm that collapses the moment someone actually gets under your skin. This is about something harder and more real than that. It's about understanding, at a level deep enough to actually change behavior, why other people have ever had power over your internal state, and then systematically taking that power back. What I know now and what I want to give you across every chapter of this book is that emotional reactivity is not a personality trait. It is not who you are. It is a learned system, a collection of habits, interpretations, and neurological patterns that were installed without your consent and have been running in the background ever since. And because it was learned, it can be unlearned. Because it is a system, it can be replaced. By the time you reach the final chapter, you will understand exactly what happens in your brain during the 6 seconds before a reaction takes hold. You will know how to read the behavior of difficult people, not as personal attacks, but as predictable patterns driven by needs that have nothing to do with you. You will have a specific method for interrupting emotional hijacking before it completes, for rewriting the internal stories that generate unnecessary suffering, and for building the kind of inner stability that doesn't depend on the world behaving the way you want it to. You will still feel things. That is not the goal. The goal is that your feelings will be chosen, not imposed. That the stranger in the parking lot becomes someone you observe rather than someone who owns the next 3 days of your life. The work begins here. The borrowed fire. Why other people's moods become yours. Picture a room with 15 people in it. Someone walks in carrying an open container of gasoline and sets it down in the center of the floor. Nobody mentions it. The meeting continues. But within 20 minutes, everyone in that room smells like gasoline. Nobody poured it on themselves. Nobody chose it. It simply moved through the air and settled on everything it touched. This is what emotional contagion does to you, every single day, in every environment you inhabit. The science behind emotional contagion is by now well established in social neuroscience, but most people encounter it only as a vague feeling they can't explain. Why they leave certain conversations feeling inexplicably heavy, why a particular co-worker's presence seems to make the room contract, why they walk into a tense household and within minutes feel tense themselves without anyone having spoken a word to them. What they are experiencing is the deeply automatic, largely unconscious process by which human nervous systems synchronize with each other. Your brain contains a category of neurons, broadly referred to in the research as mirror neurons, that respond to the observed emotional and physical states of others, as if you were experiencing those states yourself. When you watch someone wince in pain, a portion of your own pain processing circuitry activates. When you sit across from someone whose body is tense with barely contained anger, your own arousal system responds. You are, in a very literal neurological sense, partially living inside the emotional states of the people around you at all times. For most of human history, this was a survival feature of extraordinary value, the ability to instantly and unconsciously read the emotional state of the people in your tribe, to feel their fear before the predator became visible, to catch the social alarm before the conflict erupted, kept individuals alive. The most emotionally permeable members of a group were often the most socially intelligent, the most trusted, the most essential to collective functioning. But here is the trap that modern life has set for this ancient system. The same mechanism that once helped you survive a dangerous world now makes you a mirror for every difficult person you encounter. The colleague who arrives at the Monday morning meeting, radiating barely contained frustration, does not need to say a single word to you. Your nervous system will detect the tension in his jaw, the shallow speed of his breathing, the particular quality of silence that precedes emotional explosion, and it will begin automatically to prepare you for conflict you haven't chosen and may never actually face. This is borrowed fire. You are carrying heat that was never yours. What makes this so corrosive is the invisibility of the process. You do not think to yourself, I am now absorbing this person's anxiety, and it is beginning to affect my own baseline state. What you think is, I'm in a bad mood, or something feels off today, or most dangerously, people are just exhausting. The original source, the unconscious neurological import of someone else's emotional weather, gets lost. What remains is a generalized sense of depletion, irritability, or defensiveness that seems to have no cause, because by the time you notice it, you've forgotten where you caught it. Understanding that this process is happening is the first act of reclaiming your emotional state, not because awareness alone stops the contagion. It doesn't, not entirely, not immediately, but because awareness is what allows you to stop misidentifying the source. When you leave a conversation with a chronically negative person and notice that your shoulders have crept up toward your ears, when you walk away from a heated argument that wasn't even aimed at you and find yourself rehearsing counterpoints for a fight you weren't in, when you spend an hour with someone who narrates their life as an unbroken sequence of grievances and then feel, inexplicably, like your own life is heavier than it was before, that is borrowed fire. That is not your temperature. That is theirs, transferred. The first practice is simply naming it, not as an accusation, not as a judgment of the person who carried the gasoline into the room, but as a factual observation about your own internal state. This feeling arrived. It was not here before. It was likely imported. The second practice is what some researchers in affective neuroscience call emotional labeling, a process by which naming a feeling in precise language activates the prefrontal cortex and partially dampens the amygdala's processing of that feeling. The act of saying to yourself, clearly and specifically, I am experiencing anxiety that I likely absorbed from that interaction, rather than just sitting inside the feeling, creates a small but crucial gap between the stimulus and your continued response to it. It introduces the narrator, and the narrator, crucially, is you, not the person whose emotional state you imported. But there is a third layer here, and it is the one that most people miss entirely. The vulnerability to emotional contagion is not fixed. It is not a stable feature of your neurology that you are simply born with or without. Your susceptibility to other people's emotional states fluctuates significantly based on your own internal resources, your sleep quality, your stress load, the degree to which your own emotional needs are currently being met. A person who is well rested, operating from a stable sense of identity, and not carrying the accumulated weight of unresolved emotional experiences is significantly less permeable to emotional contagion than a person who is exhausted, depleted, and already running a deficit in their own regulatory capacity. This is not metaphor. The research on stress and social cognition consistently shows that when your own threat detection system is already elevated, you are more likely to pick up and amplify the emotional states of others, rather than simply register and release them. This is why the work of emotional independence is not only, or even primarily, a work of social strategy. It is not just about learning what to say, when someone tries to hand you their fire. It is about becoming, through consistent practice and deliberate lifestyle construction, the kind of vessel that doesn't ignite easily, the kind of person whose internal temperature is stable enough that the weather of other people's moods becomes interesting information rather than an immediate threat to their own equilibrium. This matters because most advice about dealing with difficult people focuses entirely on the external interaction, what to say, how to respond, which strategies to deploy. But the foundation of all of that is something quieter and more internal, the cultivation of a baseline state that is genuinely, not performatively, regulated. When your own nervous system is calm, you are not fighting the borrowed fire while also managing your own. You are responding from a place of actual surplus, and that changes everything about how the interaction unfolds. We will return to the construction of that baseline throughout this book, but the idea to carry forward from this chapter is deceptively simple. Most of what bothers you on any given day is not yours. It was manufactured somewhere else by someone else's unresolved internal weather, and it moved through the air between you and settled without your permission. The moment you see it as borrowed is the moment you stop treating it as truth. The story machine, how your brain manufactures suffering. Here is a thing that the brain does, constantly, automatically, and without your permission. It explains. Something happens. Before you have finished processing what it was, your brain has already begun constructing a narrative about why it happened, what it means about the person who did it, what it says about you, and what it implies about the future. This happens in milliseconds. It happens below the level of conscious thought. By the time you're aware of your emotional reaction, the story has already been written, and your nervous system is already responding to the story, not to the original event, but to the explanation your brain invented for it. This is the story machine, and for most people it is the single most prolific generator of unnecessary suffering in their lives. Consider what actually happens in the vast majority of interactions that trigger strong emotional reactions. A friend sends a short, clipped reply to a message you sent that was warm and detailed. A colleague walks past your desk in the morning without making eye contact. Your partner responds to a question with a tone that seems impatient. Your manager doesn't. Acknowledge a piece of work you submitted that you were proud of. These are the raw events. They are in themselves almost perfectly ambiguous. They do not contain meaning. They are sequences of behavior occurring in a context you can observe only partially, but your brain does not experience them as ambiguous. Your brain, drawing on a vast and largely unconscious archive of past experiences, emotional associations, and pattern recognition heuristics, immediately and automatically populates these ambiguous events with meaning. The clipped message means the friend is angry with you. The averted eye contact means the colleague has heard something negative about you. The impatient tone means your partner resents you. The unacknowledged work means your manager doesn't value you. The event and the explanation arrive together, fused so seamlessly that they feel like a single perception rather than a fact, plus an interpretation. Cognitive scientists have studied this process extensively, under various frameworks: attribution theory, schema theory, the negativity bias, and what emerges consistently across the research is this: the explanations your brain generates by default are systematically skewed. They over-attribute behavior to personal, stable, internal causes rather than situational, temporary, external ones. They assume hostile or negative intent where the actual situation may involve nothing more than distraction, stress, or circumstance entirely unrelated to you. And they weight ambiguous signals toward threat rather than neutrality, because a nervous system calibrated for survival will always prefer the false alarm to the missed warning. In other words, your brain is not producing fair, balanced interpretations. It is producing threat-minimizing interpretations. And in a modern social environment where most of the people around you are not, in fact, threats, where the clipped message is far more likely to reflect the sender's busy afternoon than their feelings about you, this default setting is generating suffering from thin air. The philosopher and former slave Epictetus, writing nearly 2,000 years ago in a context of radical powerlessness, made an observation that modern neuroscience has done nothing but confirm. It is not things that disturb us, but our opinions about things. What he was identifying, without the vocabulary of cognitive science, was the story machine, the gap between the event and the reaction, the layer of interpretation, invisible, automatic, largely unconscious, where the real manufacture of suffering takes place. Understanding this is not merely theoretical comfort, it is the entry point to a specific and learnable skill, the ability to separate the event from the story, to hold the story up to light and ask whether it is actually the most reasonable interpretation of what happened, and when it is not, to consciously construct a replacement. This skill has a name in cognitive behavioral therapy, where it has been developed and refined over decades of clinical research, cognitive reappraisal, and the research on its effectiveness is among the most consistent in all of psychology. Study after study confirms that the deliberate reinterpretation of emotionally significant events, not suppression of the emotion, not distraction from the situation, but an active revision of the meaning assigned to it, measurably reduces the intensity and duration of negative emotional states, and does so without the physiological costs associated with emotional suppression. But here is what the clinical descriptions of cognitive reappraisal often fail to capture. The skill is not one of talking yourself out of your feelings. It is not one of forcing yourself to feel more positive than the situation warrants, or of applying optimistic gloss to something that genuinely deserves a serious response. The skill is much more precise than that. It is the skill of asking one specific, rigorous question. Is this story actually supported by the available evidence, or is it one of several possible explanations, not necessarily the most likely one, that my brain produced automatically because it was faster than waiting for more information? The clipped message. Did your friend say anything that explicitly indicated anger? Have they been sending clipped messages to everyone lately? Or just to you? Is there any other explanation? Stress, distraction, physical exhaustion, a difficult meeting just before they read your message that is equally or more consistent with the available evidence? If the honest answer is yes, that other explanations are plausible, then the story your brain produced is not a fact. It is a guess that is currently driving a real emotional response and is about to drive real behavior, the defensive reply, the withdrawn silence, the preemptive hurt, in response to an event that may have meant nothing at all. The practice of catching the story machine does not require you to become a different kind of thinker. It requires only the insertion of a single pause, which we will examine in technical detail in the next chapter, and a single question: what else could this mean? Not what would be the most comforting interpretation, but what else is genuinely plausible? What other explanation fits the available facts? Because in most cases, the honest answer is that several explanations fit equally well, and the one your brain chose automatically was the one most likely to activate your threat response and least likely to preserve your peace. There is a particular habit of mind that distinguishes people who are rarely controlled by others from people who are constantly reacting to the behavior around them. It is not a natural gift. It is not an absence of sensitivity or a superior emotional constitution. It is the deeply practiced habit of holding their own initial interpretations loosely, of treating the first story as a draft rather than a verdict, of remaining for a few crucial seconds longer than most people can manage, genuinely curious about what actually happened rather than immediately certain that they already know. That curiosity is the opposite of what the story machine produces by default. The story machine produces certainty. It produces the feel of truth, the sensation that you have perceived something clearly and correctly, that your reaction is proportionate and justified, and it produces this sensation whether or not the underlying story is accurate. The work of this book, in many of its most practical dimensions, is the work of interrupting that false certainty just long enough to ask a better question. Because the suffering is almost never in the event. The suffering is almost always in the story. And the story, unlike the event, is something you can revise. The 6-second window, interrupting the hijack before it wins. There is a period of approximately 6 seconds between the moment your amygdala fires and the moment the neurochemical cascade it initiates, the cortisol, the adrenaline, the accelerated heart rate, the narrowed cognitive focus, reaches its full systemic expression. 6 seconds. During that window, the hijack is in motion but not yet complete. The door is still open. After those 6 seconds, you are physiologically inside the reaction. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for language, rational analysis, perspective-taking, and impulse control, is operating at reduced capacity, overwhelmed by the flood of stress hormones your amygdala has authorized. You are not thinking clearly. You are not even thinking strategically about how to appear to think clearly. You are running on evolutionary hardware that was designed for a world of immediate physical threats, and it is solving the problem in front of you the only way it knows how, with urgency, aggression, or retreat. This is not a moral failing. This is not a weakness of character. This is the mammalian threat response system doing exactly what it was built to do, in a context it was not built for. The problem is not that the system exists. The problem is that it can't tell the difference between a saber-toothed tiger and a passive-aggressive email from a coworker who CC'd your manager on something they should have resolved privately. Most people discover this window only in retrospect. They complete the reaction, the sharp words, the slammed door, the decision made in anger that cost them 3 days of repair, and then, in the relative calm of after, they wonder what happened. They say things like, "I don't know why I reacted like that," or "I knew I should have just stayed quiet." They are right that they should have. But the instruction arrived too late. They were already inside the 6 seconds before they understood what was happening, and by the time understanding arrived, the cascade had completed. The entire intervention strategy I want to give you in this chapter lives in that window. Not before the window, because you cannot prevent the amygdala from firing. That happens automatically beneath conscious awareness, in response to stimuli your threat detection system has been trained to notice. And not after the window, and because by then the most you can do is manage the damage. But inside it, in the 6-second gap between the ignition and the flood, the first thing to understand about working inside that window is that you cannot engage the prefrontal cortex directly during amygdala activation. You cannot reason your way through the first 6 seconds, because the very part of your brain that would do the reasoning is the part that's going offline. What you can do is interrupt the physiological cascade through the body, specifically through the breath, before the chemical flood becomes irreversible. This is not metaphor. The connection between breathing pattern and autonomic nervous system state is one of the most well-documented relationships in physiology. The vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve in the body, running from the brainstem through the chest and into the abdomen, is both a carrier of stress signals and the primary pathway of the parasympathetic nervous system, the system responsible for rest, recovery, and what researchers call the calm and connect response. And uniquely among the organs it connects, the lungs can be controlled voluntarily. You cannot consciously slow your heart rate. You cannot directly reduce your cortisol. But you can control your breathing, and because the vagus nerve monitors and responds to respiratory patterns, controlling your breathing is the most direct available route to modulating your own physiological state in real time. The specific mechanism that matters here is the extended exhale. When your exhale is longer than your inhale, you activate the vagal brake, the physiological mechanism by which the parasympathetic nervous system inhibits the cardiovascular and hormonal expression of the stress response. A 4-count inhale followed by a 6 or 8-count exhale, done with genuine attention to the sensation of the breath, is not a relaxation gimmick. It is a targeted intervention on the physiological cascade you are trying to interrupt. But the breath is only the first layer of the 6-second intervention. The second layer is the label. Neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman's research at UCLA demonstrated something that has significant practical implications for emotional regulation. When people verbally label an emotional state, not as an expression of it, but as a description of it, activity in the amygdala decreases measurably, while activity in the right prefrontal cortex increases. The act of naming the emotion creates a small but real shift in which brain system is in the driver's seat. It is as if the narrator, the self that observes, briefly steps forward, and the automatic reaction system steps back. The label does not need to be elaborate. It does not need to be spoken aloud. It needs to be accurate, and it needs to be genuinely descriptive rather than evaluative. Not "this is outrageous" or "I can't believe they did that." Those are not labels. Those are the story machine in operation. The label sounds like, "I notice I'm feeling anger," or "there is something that feels like humiliation happening," or "my body just signaled threat." Simple, clear, descriptive, first-person observer rather than first-person experiencer. The third layer in the 6-second window is the redirect. At the neurological level, the amygdala hijack is, in part, a focusing event. Your cognitive attention narrows to the perceived threat. The rest of your perceptual field, everything that isn't the source of the threat, fades. This narrowing is adaptive in physical danger, and completely counterproductive in social stress, because it locks your attention onto the thing that is activating you and makes it harder to access the broader context, the multiple interpretations, the long-term perspective that would allow for a more measured response. The redirect is the deliberate act of briefly widening your perceptual focus, not away from the situation. Ignoring the situation is not a strategy, it is a deferral, but beyond the immediate trigger. You shift your attention, for just a few seconds, to something neutral and concrete in your immediate environment. The physical sensation of your feet on the floor, the temperature of the air, the sound of something outside the room. This is not distraction. It is a brief deactivation of the threat focus loop, long enough for the chemical peak of the initial hijack to pass without your behavior becoming an expression of it. Combined, the breath, the label, the redirect, these three elements constitute what I call the 6-second intervention, and I want to be honest with you about what it is and what it isn't. It is not a technique that will make difficult situations cease to activate you. It will not prevent the amygdala from firing. It will not eliminate the physiological sensation of anger or the cognitive pull of the story your brain wants to tell. What it will do, practiced consistently over time, is widen the window. It will give you, reliably and repeatedly, those extra seconds between the ignition and the reaction in which you are still, genuinely, capable of choice. Viktor Frankl, writing from the most extreme circumstances of human suffering imaginable, articulated something that the neuroscience of emotional regulation has since mapped in considerable detail. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. That space, he wrote, is where our freedom lies. What he identified philosophically, and what the research now confirms biologically, is that this space is not static. It can be expanded, not through willpower, not through moral effort, but through specific physiological and cognitive practices that literally change the speed and intensity of your automatic responses over time. The 6-second window is where your freedom lives. The intervention described in this chapter is how you learn to use it. Radical ownership, taking back the only thing you ever controlled. There is a question that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it honestly, and then it becomes one of the most uncomfortable things you've ever sat with. How much of your emotional life have you been outsourcing? Not metaphorically, literally. How much of your daily internal experience, your mood when you wake up, the quality of your afternoon, the emotional tone of your evening, has been determined not by any choice you made, but by what the people around you happen to do or not do? How often has your sense of your own worth on a given day been a function of whether your manager acknowledged your work, whether your partner seemed happy to see you, whether the stranger at the coffee counter treated you with warmth or indifference? How much of your inner life has been, in practical terms, a weather vane, spinning in whatever direction the nearest person's behavior happened to blow? Most people, if they answer this honestly, find that the number is much higher than they would like to admit, not because they are weak or unusually dependent, but because the outsourcing of emotional state is the default condition of human social life. It is how we are wired at the most basic neurological level. The social reward systems in your brain, the dopamine pathways activated by approval and recognition, the cortisol suppression that accompanies a sense of belonging, are calibrated to make you responsive to social feedback, to make you care what others think, to make the quality of your relationships feel like a matter of survival, because for most of human history, it was. But the same responsiveness that once kept you connected to your tribe now makes you a hostage to every passing opinion, every ambiguous glance, every slight that may or may not have been intended. The adaptation that served the species has become the source of daily suffering for the individual, and the way out is not to become less human. It is to become more conscious, specifically to become conscious of the distinction between what genuinely deserves to affect you and what you have simply allowed to affect you by default, without examination, without consent, without any awareness that a choice was involved. This is what radical ownership means. Not the motivational poster version of taking responsibility, not the aggressive self-reliance that masquerades as strength while actually being a different kind of reactivity. Radical ownership, as I am using the term, is the specific and practiced recognition that your emotional state is yours, that it originates inside you, not outside, that the events in the world around you, including the behavior of other people, are inputs, not instructions. They are data arriving at a system that then generates a response, and the system is you. The system has always been you. The only question is whether you are running it consciously or whether it has been running you. The Stoic philosophers were perhaps the most rigorous thinkers in history on this particular subject. Marcus Aurelius, governing the most powerful empire in the world from a position of constant stress, political threat, and personal grief, kept returning in his private journals to a single idea. The only domain of genuine human freedom is the will. What he called the will, modern psychology calls the locus of control, the degree to which a person believes their outcomes are determined by their own choices versus external forces. And decades of research confirm what Marcus was writing about in the 2nd century. People who operate from an internal locus of control, who believe in practice that their responses are their own, are measurably more resilient, more emotionally stable, and more effective in navigating difficult circumstances than those who operate from an external locus, perpetually at the mercy of what the world delivers. But here is the piece that most conversations about responsibility quietly skip over. Radical ownership does not mean you are to blame for what other people do to you. This distinction matters enormously and deserves to be stated plainly. The colleague who undermines you in a meeting is responsible for their behavior. The partner who says something cruel is responsible for their words. The stranger who shrugs and steals your parking spot is responsible for being a stranger who shrugs and steals parking spots. Ownership of your emotional response is not an erasure of their accountability. It is something much more targeted than that. It is the recognition that your suffering, the duration of it, the intensity of it, the degree to which it colonizes the rest of your day, is determined not by what they did, but by what you do with what they did. That the original event may have been outside your control, while every subsequent moment of engagement with that event, every replay, every rehearsed confrontation, every generalization about human nature that you build on top of it is a choice that feels automatic because it has been made automatically so many times that automaticity now feels like inevitability. But it is a choice nonetheless, and choices can be changed. The practice of radical ownership begins with a deceptively small act, catching yourself in the moment of assigning causation, the moment when you say or think, "They made me feel this way." That phrase, "made me feel," is the grammatical signature of outsourced emotional life. It encodes in its syntax the belief that your internal state was produced by an external agent, that the cause of your experience lives outside your skin, and every time you use it without examination, you reinforce the neural architecture of helplessness. The replacement is not the forced positivity of everything happens for a reason. It is something more honest and more useful. I noticed that when they did that, I generated this response. The difference is not merely semantic, it is structural. It inserts you, the generator of the response, into the causal chain. It restores your location in your own emotional story, not as the architect of everything that happens, but as the undeniable author of everything you do with it afterward. This is the beginning of freedom, not the freedom of never being affected. That is not freedom, that is disconnection, but the freedom of conscious response, the freedom of knowing, even in the heat of a genuinely difficult moment, that you are not obligated by reflex, that the reaction you are about to have is one option among several, that you have been here before, and you have chosen differently, and you can choose differently again. It takes practice, it takes repetition, and it requires at first a degree of willingness to be uncomfortable, because radical ownership means giving up the particular relief of blame. There is something genuinely soothing about locating the source of your suffering in someone else's behavior. It is clean. It is simple. It requires nothing of you except the maintenance of grievance. Ownership is messier. It asks you to look at your own machinery, to acknowledge that the system generating your suffering is the same system that gets to generate your peace, and that the difference between those two outcomes is not what happens to you, but what you do in the 6 seconds after. That is the bargain, and it is, without question, the most worthwhile trade available to any human being who is tired of living at the mercy of other people's behavior. The expectation trap, how your demands destroy your peace. Every act of frustration in your life, without exception, involves an expectation that was not met. Not a disappointment exactly, though disappointment is part of it. Something more specific, a demand that the world, or a person in it, behave in a particular way, combined with the implicit belief that this demand was reasonable, that compliance was owed, and that the failure to comply constitutes a genuine offense against something you were entitled to. This is the expectation trap, and it is the single most democratic source of human suffering because it operates with complete indifference to how intelligent you are, how self-aware you believe yourself to be, or how sincerely committed you are to being an emotionally evolved person. It operates through the most ordinary, invisible, and pervasive mechanism imaginable, the background hum of assumptions about how things should be. You should be able to drive on a highway without people cutting you off. Meetings should start on time. People who say they will do something should do it. People who know better should behave better. Your partner, who has witnessed the impact of a particular behavior on you, should by now have adjusted that behavior. Your colleague, who is professionally competent, should not need to be managed through a basic communication task. Your adult sibling should be able to get through a family dinner without reviving the same argument that has been running since 1997. Should. Each of those sentences contains an implicit demand, and every one of those demands is pointed outward, at a world that has never, in recorded history, organized itself around any individual's preferred operating parameters. The gap between should and is, between the world as your nervous system has been calibrated to expect it, and the world as it actually presents itself, is where frustration, resentment, and low-grade chronic anger are manufactured in industrial quantities, day after day, interaction after interaction, without any particular catastrophe ever being required. The philosopher Albert Ellis, who developed rational emotive behavior therapy in the mid-20th century, identified what he called masturbation, the habit of converting preferences into demands, of mentally upgrading should into must, would be nice into is absolutely required. What Ellis observed clinically, and what subsequent decades of cognitive behavioral research have confirmed, is that the intensity of emotional distress is not primarily a function of what happens to us. It is a function of the rigidity of the demands we were holding when it happened. The more absolutist the expectation, they must behave this way, this must go according to plan, I must be treated with respect in every interaction, the more violently the nervous system responds to any deviation from it, regardless of how minor that deviation actually is. This matters because the expectation trap is not about having high standards. People conflate the two constantly, and the conflation is worth untangling. Having high standards means you know what quality looks like, you work toward it in your own behavior, you choose relationships and environments that reflect it, and you are willing to address situations when the standard is consistently and significantly missed. That is not what the expectation trap is about. The expectation trap is about the unconscious extension of your preferences into the behavior of everyone around you, combined with a felt sense of entitlement to compliance. It is the background assumption that the people in your life should, by virtue of basic human decency, social competence, or sheer proximity to you, organize their behavior around your preferences without your having explicitly communicated those preferences and without their having agreed to them. Put that way, the absurdity becomes visible. But the trap is that it never feels absurd from inside it. From inside it, it feels like a reasonable expectation of basic human behavior being consistently, infuriatingly violated. The colleague who interrupts you is not just being rude. They are violating a standard of professional behavior that any reasonable person would share. The friend who runs late is not just disorganized. They are demonstrating a disregard for your time that reveals something about how much they value you. The family member who offers unsolicited criticism is not just being themselves. They are crossing a boundary that should be obvious to anyone who cares about you. Should be obvious. Should know better. Should respect that by now. Each of these is an expectation that has been elevated, invisibly and automatically, from preference to demand. And the demand is being applied to people who never agreed to it, in situations where agreement was never solicited, in a world that does not consult your preferences before proceeding. The release of rigid expectations is not a counsel of passivity. It is not the instruction to accept everything and want nothing, and let everyone behave however they wish without consequence. That would be a different kind of dysfunction. The release of rigid expectations is the specific, targeted practice of distinguishing between your preferences and the universe's obligations, of holding your standards for your own behavior while loosening your demands on everyone else's. There is a framework that comes from the Stoic tradition, but has been independently rediscovered by virtually every school of contemplative psychology across cultures and centuries. the distinction between what is up to you and what is not, your thoughts, your responses, your choices, your sustained attention. These are, in principle, up to you. The behavior of other people, the outcome of events you set in motion, the circumstances you were born into, the way the person in front of you in traffic decides to drive. These are not up to you. They never were. The suffering generated by treating them as if they were is proportional to how long you have been trying. When you release the expectation, not abandon. The preference, not pretend you don't care, but genuinely release the demand that it be otherwise. Something specific happens neurologically. The threat signal deactivates. The amygdala, which was monitoring the situation as a potential violation of something important, receives the information that there is nothing to defend here, no standard being enforced, no entitlement being protected. What was a source of activation becomes a source of information. The late colleague is someone whose relationship with time is different from yours, which is useful to know for planning purposes. The interrupting co-worker is someone who processes in a particular way, which suggests a particular kind of communication strategy. The family member with opinions about your life choices is someone operating from a set of beliefs about what constitutes a good life, beliefs that have nothing to do with the quality of the life you are actually living. None of this requires pretending that behavior is acceptable when it isn't. You can address the colleague, establish expectations with the coworker, set limits with the family member, but you can do all of these things from a place of genuine calm rather than frustrated demand, and the difference in outcome, both for the interaction and for your own nervous system, is extraordinary. People respond differently to a request made from clarity than to a demand made from grievance, and your own experience of delivering the message is different, too. The calm address is energizing. The frustrated demand is depleting, whether or not it is ever satisfied. This is the fundamental economic argument against the expectation trap. It costs you continuously, and it rarely produces the outcome you are hoping for. People do not generally become more considerate because you are frustrated with their inconsiderateness. They become defensive. They become resentful. They comply in the short term and resist in the long term, or they simply don't change at all, because the demand, even when legitimate, arrived in a form that activated their own threat response rather than their capacity for genuine reflection. The energy you are spending maintaining your demands is energy you could be redirecting toward the only behavior you can actually change, your own. The expectations trap keeps you perpetually focused on the gap between how people are and how you need them to be. Releasing it returns your focus to the only territory in which you have genuine jurisdiction, and that territory, your own mind, your own choices, your own responses, turns out to be more than enough to work with. Detachment is not distance. Learning to care without being consumed. There is a misunderstanding at the heart of most conversations about emotional detachment, and it causes real harm. It goes like this. If you want to stop being controlled by other people's behavior, you need to care less about people. You need to want less from your relationships. You need to lower your emotional investment in outcomes, become more self-sufficient, more independent, more strategic in how much of yourself you bring to any given interaction. This is not detachment. This is armor, and armor is not what we are after. The distinction matters because armor solves the problem of being hurt by eliminating the capacity for genuine connection, and genuine connection is not the problem. The capacity to love, to be moved, to care deeply about outcomes, to feel the weight of another person's pain. None of this is the source of your suffering. The source of your suffering is the unconscious equation you have built between caring and needing, between loving and requiring a particular response, between investing in something and demanding that it return according to specifications you set unilaterally. Genuine detachment, in the psychological and philosophical traditions that understand it most clearly, is not the reduction of caring. It is the decoupling of caring from control. It is the cultivated ability to hold something you value, a relationship, an outcome, a conversation, with open hands rather than clenched fists, to want something genuinely while simultaneously releasing the demand that it be delivered in a particular way, to care deeply about a person while releasing the demand that they respond to your caring in the specific manner your nervous system has decided would constitute adequate proof of their love. The Buddhist concept of upadana, often translated as clinging or attachment, is not, in the original teaching, an instruction to stop caring about things. It is a description of a particular quality of holding. The suffering, in this framework, comes not from having desires, but from the quality of rigidity with which those desires are held, from the transformation of a preference into a demand, from the moment when I would like this to be true shifts, invisibly and automatically, into this must be true, or I will not be okay. That last phrase is the key, or I will not be okay. Embedded in every act of clinging is a threat, not the threat that someone else has made, but the threat your own nervous system is running in the background. The belief that your emotional stability, your sense of worth, your fundamental okayness is contingent on this particular outcome, this particular response, this particular person behaving in a particular way. The moment you identify that hidden equation, I need X to happen in order to feel Y, you can see precisely where your emotional hostage-taking is occurring, and you can see that the hostage-taker is not the person whose behavior you are waiting on. It is you, holding yourself captive to an outcome you cannot control. What makes this so difficult to address is that the most common version of it involves people we love most. It is easy to practice non-attachment with strangers. Their behavior carries no particular weight in the construction of your emotional reality. But with your partner, your children, your closest friends, the stakes feel genuinely different. The caring is real. The investment is real. The vulnerability is real. And out of that real caring, real investment, real vulnerability, the demand grows quietly and visibly. Because I love you this much and because what you do affects me this deeply, you owe me a particular kind of response. You don't. No one does. And the moment you can hold that truth without it feeling like a loss, the moment you can love someone fully without requiring them to love you back in a pre-specified format, is the moment the relationship becomes genuinely free for both of you. Emotional self-sufficiency, which is the practical name for what I am describing, is often mischaracterized as the ability to not need anyone. This is wrong and also impossible. Human beings are constitutively relational. The need for connection, belonging, and love is not a weakness to be overcome. It is a fundamental feature of the species. What emotional self-sufficiency actually means is that you are not running a deficit so large that every interaction becomes an extraction attempt. It means that your baseline experience of your own worth, your own safety, your own capacity to be okay in the world, does not depend on external confirmation to function. It means you can receive love without needing it to plug a hole. You can be disappointed without it becoming evidence of something terrible. You can care about an outcome without your sense of self riding entirely on whether you get it. This is different from not caring. In fact, genuine self-sufficiency often enables a deeper quality of caring than is available to someone who is emotionally depleted and extracting from relationships rather than contributing to them. When you are not running on deficit, when your basic sense of adequacy is not contingent on today's approval ratings, you can be present with people in a way that is genuinely generous rather than strategically warm. You can listen without rehearsing. You can support without accumulating debt. You can disagree without the disagreement threatening something fundamental. The practice of detachment without distance begins with a single clarifying question. What am I holding on to, and why? Not as a judgment, but as a genuine inquiry. When you notice yourself anxiously monitoring someone's response to you, what is the belief underneath the monitoring? When you feel the particular ache of unacknowledged effort, what was the implicit contract you were running? When a conversation ends and you replay it for hours, looking for the precise location of the wound, what were you expecting that you didn't get? These are not rhetorical questions. They are diagnostic ones. They are pointing at the places where your caring has quietly calcified into demand, where your investment has generated an invoice you are waiting for someone else to pay. And each time you find one of those places, you have an opportunity to do something genuinely powerful, to consciously revise the contract, to want the thing without requiring it, to care about the relationship without making your peace contingent on its performance. None of this is fast work. None of it produces immediate relief. The deepest versions of this work, the ones that involve revising the fundamental equation you constructed in childhood about what you need from other people to feel safe, require sustained attention over a long period of time. But there is a version of this practice that is available right now, in the next interaction, with the next person who fails to respond to you in the way you were hoping. The pause before the extraction attempt. The moment of noticing that you were waiting for something specific. the choice to release the requirement without releasing the care. That moment is the definition of open hands. And open hands, it turns out, can hold far more than clenched fists ever could. The 4 faces of difficult people, and why none of them are about you. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from difficulty itself, but from difficulty that feels personal, from the sense that a particular person's behavior is aimed at you, targeted toward you, a deliberate and specific expression of their assessment of your worth. This exhaustion is so much worse than the ordinary kind. It is the kind that lingers after the interaction ends, that colonizes your thinking at 3 in the morning, that makes you rehearse responses to arguments that have already concluded, and it is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, built on a false premise. The behavior of difficult people is almost never about you. It is almost always about them, about the particular strategy their nervous system developed, often decades before they met you, for managing threat, securing connection, maintaining control, or avoiding the specific form of pain that their history has taught them to fear most. You are not the subject of their behavior. You are the current object of it. The subject is almost always something much older, much more internal, and much more fixed than any individual interaction between the two of you could possibly explain. Understanding this does not make difficult people easy to be around. It does not eliminate the impact of their behavior, or suggest that impact doesn't matter. What it does is remove the layer of personal wound from on top of the ordinary challenge. And without that layer, without the sense that this is a deliberate attack on you specifically, the interaction becomes something you can navigate strategically, rather than something you are compelled to survive emotionally. There are 4 primary behavioral patterns that most people describe when they describe difficult people in their lives. Each one has a characteristic neurological and psychological signature. Each one activates a particular kind of response in the people around it. And each one becomes vastly less personally threatening once you understand what it actually is. The first pattern belongs to what I call the territorial aggressor. This is the person who manages their internal experience of threat through externalized dominance. They are loud in meetings not because they know more than everyone else, but because volume has historically been a reliable way to preempt the particular vulnerability that comes from being wrong in public. They interrupt not because they are disrespectful of your thoughts, but because they are managing the anxiety generated by silence, by the possibility that the conversation will develop in a direction they can't control. They push, they challenge, they escalate, because confrontation is a more familiar and tolerable experience for them than the alternative, which is uncertainty. Their aggression is a regulation strategy. It has been refined through years of reinforcement because for them, it works. It reduces their internal sense of threat by generating an external sense of control. The mistake most people make with territorial aggressors is to treat the aggression as the content of the message, to take the volume and the challenge personally and respond to it personally, either by escalating to match their energy, which gives them the conflict they use as a regulatory tool, or by withdrawing, which confirms the dominance they were seeking to establish. Neither response addresses the actual situation. The only response that effectively interrupts the pattern is the deliberate introduction of calm, not performed calm, not the studied neutrality of someone who is furious underneath, but genuine physiological de-escalation that projects a different kind of signal into the interaction. When you lower your voice slightly and slow your speech rate in the presence of someone escalating, you are not being passive. You are introducing counter-contagion. You are offering your nervous system's regulated state as an alternative to the chaos they are generating, and often, not always, but often enough to be worth practicing, the mirror neurons that made you vulnerable to borrowing their fire in the first chapter work in your favor in this one. The second pattern is the indirect saboteur. This is the person whose primary relationship with anger and frustration is through channels that can be plausibly denied. The agreeable colleague who consistently fails to deliver. The partner who says they're fine and then generates 3 days of cold silence. The friend who expresses support while subtly undermining. The family member whose jokes always land just on the edge of the wound they have learned, over years, to locate with precision. The indirect saboteur is not being strategic in any conscious sense. They are operating from a deep and often pre-verbal belief that direct expression of anger or need is dangerous, that if they ask for what they want, or name what bothers them, the consequence will be abandonment, retaliation, or humiliation. The indirect behavior is the only version of need expression that feels survivable to them, and the target of that expression, the person whose calm compliance they are disrupting, the recipient of the jokes that cut, is not the actual subject of their communication. They are the available surface on which an older, more fundamental fear is being projected. The worst response to an indirect saboteur is to match the indirection, to become passive-aggressive yourself, to accumulate grievances quietly, to grow resentful of behavior you have never named directly. This simply confirms the system, that indirect communication is the only kind available in this relationship, and that no one's actual needs will ever be stated clearly enough to be addressed. The most effective response is radical transparency, delivered without heat, a direct, calm, specific description of the pattern you are observing, combined with a genuine invitation for direct communication, not a confrontation, not an accusation, an opening. The third pattern is the crisis architect. This is the person for whom connection and attention have historically been most reliably generated by emergency. They have learned, through early experiences that were probably genuinely difficult, probably genuinely understaffed by the adults around them, that ordinary presence is not enough to secure the relational availability they need. That crisis creates a quality of attention that normal circumstance does not. So they construct crisis, not deliberately, not cynically, but automatically, because the nervous system will always return to what has worked before. The crisis architect drains people because they are, in effect, making continuous withdrawals from the emotional bank of everyone around them without any mechanism for making deposits. They are not doing this maliciously. They are doing it out of the most fundamental human fear. The fear that they will not be noticed unless they are emergent. The response that serves neither of you is full enrollment. The decision to become their primary emotional first responder. To organize your availability around their latest crisis. To provide the quality of attention that temporarily reduces their anxiety, while permanently increasing their reliance on crisis as an access mechanism. The response that serves both of you is the combination of genuine care with firm structural limits. You can be present without being on call. You can care about someone's well-being without accepting the premise that well-being is only achievable through your undivided emergency attention. The limit is not cruelty. The limit is the refusal to reinforce the system that is, ultimately, as harmful to them as it is exhausting to you. The fourth pattern is the validation monopolist. This is the person who requires, functionally, all the oxygen in the room. Every conversation turns toward them. Every shared experience becomes a platform for their narrative. Every expression of your own experience triggers, within moments, an escalation to a larger version of the same experience that is happening to them. They are not listening to you. They are waiting for the next opportunity to speak. They are not curious about you. They are managing the profound anxiety that comes for them from the possibility of not being seen. The validation monopolist is not contemptible. They are in pain. The constant performance of significance is exhausting work, and it is work being done in service of a wound that no amount of external validation will ever actually heal, because the wound is not a deficit of attention from others. It is a deficit of genuine self-worth, a fundamental uncertainty about whether they matter that no quantity of outside confirmation can permanently resolve. You are not going to fix that. Your job, in the interaction, is simply to not let their need for all of the oxygen become your responsibility to provide it. Strategic disengagement, the calm redirection of attention, the refusal to compete for recognition or correct the exaggerations, the simple act of turning toward someone else in the room without drama or explanation, is not dismissal. It is the appropriate response to a pattern that is not yours to solve. What connects all four of these patterns, and this is the point that makes all of the above genuinely useful rather than merely interesting, is that none of them originated in you. None of them are responses to anything specific about who you are. They are coping systems, built before you arrived, running in the bodies of people who are managing experiences that predate your relationship with them by years or decades. When the territorial aggressor escalates at you, they are not seeing you. They are seeing threat. When the indirect saboteur deploys the joke that lands on the wound, they are not targeting your specific vulnerability. They are expressing their own. When the crisis architect constructs an emergency that requires your presence, they are not commenting on your value. They are demonstrating their fear. The moment you can hold this clearly, The moment the behavior of a difficult person becomes, for you, interesting data about their internal world rather than evidence of your value, the interaction changes, not because they change, though sometimes they do, but because you have removed yourself from the equation. In the only way that matters, you have stopped taking the data personally, and when nothing they do is about you, nothing they do can control you. Reading the room. Social intelligence as emotional armor. There is a particular skill that the most emotionally stable people in any room tend to share, and it is not the skill most people assume it is. It is not the ability to remain impassive. It is not a talent for appearing unaffected. It is not even especially good communication, though it supports communication enormously. The skill is this: the ability to read what is actually happening in an interaction below the level of its stated content, and to use that reading to stay 3 moves ahead of their own reactivity. This is social intelligence in its most practical form, and it functions as emotional armor, not because it keeps experience out, but because it transforms ambiguous social signals, the kind that your story machine would otherwise fill with threat, into legible information you can actually work with. Most interpersonal conflict is not generated by what people explicitly say to each other. It is generated by the gap between what is said and what is communicated through every other available channel: body language, vocal tone, timing, spatial behavior, the particular quality of attention someone is or isn't giving you, the energy in a room before anyone has spoken. When you are not reading those channels, you are navigating with partial information. Your story machine fills in the blanks. The blanks, as we have established, get filled in with threat by default. When you are reading those channels, you are working with the actual situation rather than the story your brain invented about it, and the actual situation is almost always more manageable than the story. The most fundamental level of social reading is emotional state detection, the ability to accurately identify what someone is experiencing emotionally before they have named it, often before they are fully conscious of it themselves. This is not mystical, it is observational. The human body is an extraordinarily expressive system, and stress, anxiety, fear, and anger all have reliable, cross-culturally consistent physical signatures. Elevated stress appears in the body as increased muscle tension in the jaw, neck, and shoulders, accompanied by a subtle elevation in vocal pitch and a marginally faster speech rate. The person who is running at a higher baseline arousal than usual will often orient their body slightly away from whoever they are speaking to, a micro-withdrawal that the threat system initiates before the conscious mind has decided anything. Their eye contact will be less sustained. Their gestures will be more constrained, or in some individuals more expansive and forceful, depending on whether their stress response tilts toward withdrawal or dominance. Reading these signals is not about reading minds. It is about making better predictions. When you walk into a conversation and observe that the other person is already running elevated, that their jaw is set, their sentences are shorter than usual, their breath is high in their chest, you are not diagnosing them. You are gathering information that is highly relevant to how the next several minutes will go. Specifically, you are learning that this is not the moment for the difficult request, the complex negotiation, or the feedback that requires openness to hear. This is the moment for brief, low-demand interaction that allows the arousal to settle before you introduce anything that requires their full regulatory capacity to receive. This is not manipulation. It is the opposite. It is the decision to engage with the actual human being in front of you, rather than the content of your prepared agenda. It is the recognition that the success of any interaction depends not only on what you bring to it, but on the state of the person you are bringing it to. The second level of social reading is motivational architecture, understanding what a person is fundamentally trying to accomplish in any given interaction, often below the level of their conscious awareness. Every behavior serves a function. The colleague who challenges your proposals in every meeting is not simply contrary. They are managing something, perhaps a need to demonstrate expertise, perhaps an anxiety about being seen as uninvolved, perhaps a competitive dynamic that has nothing to do with your specific proposal and everything to do with a hierarchy they are still trying to locate themselves within. The family member who turns every conversation toward their own experience is not simply self-absorbed. They are managing a need for connection through the only channel that has historically felt safe. When you can see the motivational architecture beneath the surface behavior, you can respond to the actual need rather than the behavior it is generating. You can give the challenging colleague a specific acknowledgement of their expertise before presenting your proposal, not as flattery, but as a genuine address of the need underneath the challenge. You can make space in the conversation for the family member's experience, not out of obligation, but out of the recognition that a few moments of genuine attention will produce more relational ease than an hour of strategically deflecting their attempts to be seen. The third level is what researchers in social cognition call theory of mind, the ability to model, with reasonable accuracy, the internal perspective of another person, not to read their mind, but to genuinely imagine their subjective experience of the situation you are both in. This requires, temporarily and deliberately, stepping out of your own perspective and into theirs, not to agree with their perspective or to find it reasonable, but simply to understand it as a coherent response to their history, their current state, and their reading of the situation. This act, genuine perspective-taking rather than strategic empathy performance, is the single most powerful de-escalation tool available in any interpersonal conflict, not because it resolves the conflict, but because it transforms the quality of the interaction. When the person across from you has the experience of being genuinely understood, not agreed with, not validated in the sense of having their behavior endorsed, but actually seen, the defensive arousal that was maintaining the conflict drops measurably. The amygdala, which is always monitoring the social environment for signs of threat or safety, receives through genuine perspective-taking the information that it is understood, and understanding is one of the most powerful safety signals the human nervous system knows. You do not need to manufacture this. You do not need to feel warmth for someone who has been genuinely difficult in order to make the effort to understand their perspective. You need only the intellectual curiosity to ask, from where they are sitting with the information they have in the state they are currently in, what does this situation look like? That question alone, asked with genuine interest rather than strategic intent, will produce information that changes how you engage. And changed engagement, even when only one person makes the change, changes the dynamic. Social intelligence as emotional armor works because it replaces ambiguity with legibility. The behaviors that most reliably activate your story machine and send your amygdala into threat detection mode are ambiguous behaviors. The tonal shift you can't quite interpret, the message that could mean several things, the interaction that ends in a way that leaves you uncertain about where you stand. Social intelligence narrows that ambiguity, not to zero. No amount of skill eliminates it entirely, but enough that the story machine has less blank space to fill with threat. Enough that you are working with something closer to reality than the worst-case narrative your nervous system would otherwise produce. And when you are working with reality, you are calm, not because reality is easy, but because reality, even difficult reality, is something you can actually work with. The story your brain invents about reality is often far more frightening, far more personally threatening, and far more exhausting than the actual situation ever turns out to be. Read the room, not to control it, to stay free inside it. When it's family, the hardest battlefield, there is a reason that the most emotionally skilled people you will ever meet, people who navigate professional conflict with extraordinary composure, who remain genuinely unruffled by difficult strangers, who have built real and practiced mastery over their reactive patterns, often report that family is still the hardest, that a single dinner with certain relatives can undo weeks of careful internal work, that the person who can hold their center in a board meeting falls apart at Thanksgiving. This is not a failure of their practice. It is a function of the specific architecture of family relationships, which operates by rules that are categorically different from every other relational system in human life. Family is where the patterns were built. Not refined, not reinforced, built. The neurological architecture of your emotional responses, the specific triggers, the characteristic defenses, the particular quality of wound that a certain tone of voice or a specific kind of dismissal opens in you, was constructed largely within the family system of your childhood, in conditions you had no power to choose and no framework to understand at the time. The people who are part of that system carry, for your nervous system, a weight that no subsequent relationship can fully replicate. They are not just people with whom you have a history. They are, in a very real neurological sense, the original environment in which your threat detection system was calibrated. This is why your most sophisticated adult self can disappear in their company, why you can walk into a family gathering as a person who has done real work on yourself and find within 45 minutes that you are operating from patterns you thought you had long outgrown. The environment, the specific combination of particular voices, particular relationship dynamics, particular physical spaces, is a retrieval cue for the neural networks that were built there. And those networks, activated by context, don't care how much therapy you have done or how many audiobooks you have listened to. They fire because the environment is telling them that this is when they fire. Understanding this is not an invitation to helplessness. It is a map. It tells you exactly why the work of emotional regulation in family contexts requires something different from what works everywhere else. Not more control, not more technique, but a specific kind of preemptive awareness that is calibrated to the particular history you are carrying into the room. The first thing that preemptive awareness requires is an honest accounting of your own unfinished business. Not as a therapeutic excavation, that is separate work, valuable in its own right, but different from what we are doing here, as a practical inventory. The question is not what happened in your childhood or who is to blame for which patterns. The question is, which specific behaviors, from which specific people, in which specific relational contexts, reliably bypass your adult regulatory capacity and activate something much older? You know the answers. You may not have stated them this precisely, but you know them. You know which family member's particular tone of voice lands in you like a stone. You know which category of comment about your choices, your body, your relationships, your professional trajectory arrives with enough historical weight behind it to feel like something far heavier than its literal content. You know which dynamics, the old competition with a sibling, the particular quality of a parent's disappointment, the unspoken hierarchy that organizes every gathering, are still running in the background of interactions you would prefer to experience as simple adult relationships between equals. Naming these is not indulgence, it is intelligence gathering, because the family system that activates these patterns is, in most cases, highly predictable. The comment that will be made has been made before. The dynamic that will emerge has emerged reliably for years. The pattern is not a surprise. What is often a surprise, what catches people off guard repeatedly, in the same gathering, with the same people, over the same terrain, is the intensity of the response it generates. The degree to which something that should by now be familiar still has the power to reach through the adult and find the child. What the familiarity actually offers, if you choose to use it, is the ability to prepare. Preparation for family interactions is not about scripting responses or rehearsing arguments. It is about deciding, in advance, who you want to be in that room, not what you want to achieve. Achievement in family contexts is often a mirage, and the pursuit of it generates most of the conflict. Who you want to be. The specific qualities of presence you are committed to maintaining, regardless of what the environment activates in you. For most people, this preparation involves a few specific decisions. The decision about what is not up for discussion, not as a defensive strategy, but as a genuine act of self-protection that is also, paradoxically, an act of relational generosity. The topics that reliably generate conflict, that have generated conflict for years, that will continue to generate conflict until the underlying relationship dynamic shifts in some fundamental way, are not going to be resolved at this gathering. Bringing them up or engaging with them when others raise them is not an act of honesty or courage. It is an act of optimism that the evidence does not support. The second decision involves the management of expectations, which we examined in depth earlier in a general context, but which requires specific application in family settings. Family gatherings in particular are almost universally approached with an implicit hope that this time will be different, that the old patterns won't emerge, that the relative who has always been difficult will, through some unspecified mechanism, have become less so. This hope is understandable, and sometimes, rarely, gradually, over years of cumulative change, it is even justified. But approaching a specific gathering with this hope as your primary operating premise is a setup for exactly the kind of frustrated expectation that generates suffering. The alternative is not pessimism, it is accuracy. Your family members are going to be who they are. The system is going to operate the way it operates, and you are going to be the person you have chosen in advance to be, regardless. There is something specifically important about family conflict that distinguishes it from most other interpersonal difficulty, and it is this. In family systems, the behavior of difficult individuals is almost always intelligible once you understand the system they are maintaining. The critical parent is not randomly critical. They are often maintaining, through criticism, the role of the person who cares enough to have standards, a role that for them is bound up with love in a way that may feel alien to you, but is entirely coherent from within their own emotional history. The sibling who competes is not randomly competitive. They are managing a scarcity that was real at some point, a scarcity of parental attention, recognition, or safety, and the competition is the strategy that once served their survival, even if it now serves nothing but the perpetuation of a dynamic that exhausts everyone involved. This does not mean the behavior is acceptable or that your response to it is optional. It means the behavior has a logic that is not about you. The criticism is not an accurate assessment of your choices. The competition is not an honest evaluation of your worth. They are expressions of someone else's unresolved history being enacted on the nearest available relational surface. And you, by virtue of being family, by virtue of being present in the original environment, where these patterns were built, are among the most available surfaces there is. Seeing this clearly, not as an excuse for the behavior, but as an accurate description of its origins, changes what you feel when it lands. Not the first instant, perhaps. The nervous system will fire regardless of your intellectual understanding, but in the seconds after the initial activation, in the window we discussed earlier, the understanding changes the story. Instead of "this person is attacking me," the story becomes "this person is enacting something old, and I do not have to let it define the next hour of my life." Instead of "why do they always do this to me?" the question becomes "what would it look like to stay myself inside this system right now?" Staying yourself inside the family system is the specific challenge and the specific goal, not fixing the system, not educating its members, not achieving recognition or resolution, or the particular form of relational completion that you may have been waiting for since childhood. Simply remaining, as fully as possible, the person you have become, in the presence of the environment that formed you, before you had any say in who that person would be. This is harder than anything else in this book. It is also, for most people, where the most meaningful growth occurs. The professional unshakable, turning the workplace into a training ground. Work is where emotional reactivity is most expensive, and emotional mastery is most visibly rewarded. This is not because the professional world is kinder or more rational than other human environments. It is often neither. It is because the stakes of each interaction are legible in ways that make the costs of reactivity immediately obvious. The relationship damaged by an intemperate email, the opportunity foreclosed by a defensive response to feedback, the reputation quietly revised in the minds of colleagues who witnessed an escalation that a more regulated person would have absorbed without expression. The professional consequences of emotional reactivity are specific, observable, and cumulative in ways that make the workplace one of the most effective training grounds available, not for avoiding emotional activation, but for developing the practiced ability to choose your response to it. The central insight about professional emotional mastery is one that most people arrive at backwards. They treat emotional regulation at work as a performance requirement, something they must do, to appear competent, to protect their professional image, to meet the implicit expectation that adults in professional settings do not behave like people who are upset. This framing makes emotional regulation a burden. It turns composure into a mask that must be maintained, which requires energy, and which eventually fails in proportion to the gap between what is being felt and what is being performed. The shift that produces genuine professional mastery is the recognition that emotional regulation at work is not about appearance, it is about function. It is about maintaining access to your full cognitive capacity, your creativity, your analytical precision, your interpersonal acuity, your strategic thinking, in exactly the circumstances that most reliably degrade it. Because the professional situations that most activate your emotional reactivity are, almost without exception, the situations in which you most need to think clearly. The high-stakes presentation to difficult stakeholders. The performance review that does not reflect your own assessment of your work. The meeting in which a colleague takes credit for something you contributed. The project that is failing due to factors outside your control, but for which you are accountable. These are not the moments to be managed emotionally because professional norms require it. They are the moments to be managed emotionally, because how you think in these moments will determine the quality of every decision, communication, and relationship that follows from them. Your composure is not a courtesy to your professional environment. It is the protection of your own capacity to function at the level the situation actually requires. The most common professional trigger, and the one that reveals more clearly than any other the specific shape of a person's emotional architecture, is criticism. Not extreme criticism, not unfair criticism, though that has its own distinct texture. Ordinary, proportionate, sometimes even genuinely helpful criticism of work that you care about and have invested yourself in. The manager who tells you that a report needs to be restructured, the client who says the proposal missed the mark, the colleague who points out, in front of others, a flaw in your analysis. These moments generate a specific and predictable cascade: the initial sting of the assessment, the rapid internal evaluation of whether it is accurate, the defensive mobilization that begins regardless of that evaluation, and then, if the defensive mobilization goes unchecked, some form of self-protective response that serves neither the relationship nor the outcome. The defensive mobilization is automatic. It is generated by the same threat detection system that governs all emotional reactivity, because criticism of your work activates, at the neurological level, a threat to identity. If your sense of worth is entangled with your professional performance, if being seen as competent is something your nervous system has indexed as a survival requirement, then criticism of your work arrives as something the amygdala interprets as an attack on your status, your belonging, your adequacy. And the amygdala, as we have established, does not respond proportionately to perceived threats. It responds urgently. The separation of your worth from your work is the single most important internal shift available in the professional domain, not because your work doesn't matter. It does, and caring about it is appropriate and useful, but because your value as a human being cannot intelligently be indexed to the quality of any specific deliverable, and allowing it to be indexed there turns every piece of feedback into an existential event. It keeps you perpetually defensive in a professional environment that will always, reliably contain imperfection, revision, and the judgment of people whose standards may not align with yours. When a piece of criticism arrives, and the defensive mobilization begins, the most powerful intervention available is not the suppression of the defensiveness. It is a genuine, in-the-moment act of decoupling. The brief internal recognition that what is being assessed is a piece of work, not a person. That the revision being requested is information about the gap between what you produced and what was needed, not a verdict on your capacity or your worth. That the person delivering the feedback is, in almost every case, attempting to improve an outcome rather than diminish a human being. This decoupling allows you to do something that defensiveness makes neurologically impossible: to actually hear the feedback, to evaluate it honestly, without the distortion of self-protection, to extract from it whatever is genuinely useful and to disagree with whatever is not, but to disagree from a place of genuine engagement rather than reflexive resistance. The workplace also offers a particularly rich environment for the practice of strategic patience, the cultivation of the capacity to absorb friction without expressing it, not because the friction is irrelevant, but because the timing and manner of addressing it determine its outcome more than the content of the address itself. The colleague who needs to be corrected, the meeting that is running in entirely the wrong direction, the process that is inefficient and everyone knows it, and no one is saying so. These are situations that generate a specific kind of low-grade activation, not the acute spike of a direct personal conflict, but the sustained pressure of ongoing inefficiency, misdirection, or interpersonal friction that is not being addressed. Strategic patience is not passive endurance. It is the practiced skill of timing, of recognizing that the moment of maximum activation is rarely the moment of maximum effectiveness, and that the 5 minutes spent regulating before addressing something almost always produces a better outcome than the 5 seconds it would take to address it reactively. It is the discipline of the well-placed word in the right moment, informed by genuine calm, rather than the immediately satisfying, but ultimately counterproductive escalation that comes from addressing friction while you are inside it. The workplace rewards this skill visibly and substantially. The person who can remain calm when everyone else is escalating becomes, by default, the person others orient toward in moments of collective stress. The person who can receive difficult feedback without defensiveness becomes the person trusted with more challenging and consequential responsibilities. The person who can address conflict directly but without heat becomes the person the organization relies on to navigate the situations that most people avoid. None of this requires the suppression of genuine feeling. It requires the practiced ability to choose when and how feeling is expressed, which is simply the definition of emotional maturity, made specific and practical for the professional context. There is one more dimension of professional emotional mastery that deserves direct address, and it is the one that most professional development conversations carefully avoid: the management of genuine injustice. The boss who consistently takes credit for your work. The organization that promotes people by criteria that have nothing to do with merit. The colleague who is treated differently because of who they are rather than what they do. These are not situations that can be resolved through emotional regulation alone, and suggesting otherwise would be a disservice. They are situations that require response, potentially formal, potentially significant, potentially career-defining. What emotional mastery offers in these situations is not the instruction to accept them. It is the capacity to address them effectively. The grievance raised from a place of genuine regulation, specific, factual, focused on behavior and impact rather than character and intent, is received differently, taken more seriously, and navigated more successfully than the same grievance raised in the heat of reactive anger. This is not fair. It should not be necessary to regulate your legitimate anger in order for your legitimate complaint to be heard. But it is true, and using that truth, maintaining your composure precisely because the stakes are high enough to demand that your communication be maximally effective, is not a compromise of your position. It is the most powerful expression of it. The energy architecture, building a body that supports a calm mind. Everything else in this book, the 6-second intervention, the story machine awareness, the practice detachment, the social reading, the family navigation, the professional composure, all of it is built on a foundation that most people treat as an afterthought. The foundation is the body, not as a philosophical concept, not as a reminder that you are embodied in some general sense, but as the specific daily concrete reality that your emotional regulatory capacity is a biological phenomenon and it runs on biological resources that are either available or they are not. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that executes every technique in this book, that holds the 6-second intervention open, that generates the alternative story, that practices the detachment, that reads the room, that chooses the strategic response over the reactive one, is an energy-intensive system. It is the most recently evolved part of the human brain, the most metabolically expensive, and the first to degrade when the resources it runs on fall below the threshold it requires. Before the amygdala becomes hyper-reactive, before the stress hormones chronically elevate, before you feel what gets described as being triggered more easily or having a shorter fuse, the underlying reality is simpler. Your regulatory system is running on insufficient fuel. Sleep is the most direct and most consistently underappreciated variable in emotional regulation. The research on sleep deprivation and emotional reactivity is among the most striking in the entire literature of psychological science. A single night of significantly disrupted sleep, not total sleep deprivation, just the kind of moderately poor night that most people have regularly, without considering it a significant event, produces measurable increases in amygdala reactivity to emotionally negative stimuli. The same ambiguous facial expression that a well-rested brain processes as neutral gets processed by a sleep-deprived brain as threatening. The same critical comment that a rested person receives as information gets received by an exhausted person as an attack. This is not weakness. This is neurobiology. The amygdala's threat detection calibration is directly influenced by sleep-dependent processes, particularly the REM sleep stages during which the brain processes emotional memories and recalibrates arousal thresholds. When you are consistently undersleeping, your emotional regulatory system is operating from a calibration that is set too sensitive. You are working against a neurological headwind every time you try to implement the techniques in this book. The techniques will still help, but they will require significantly more conscious effort, and they will fail at lower thresholds than they would with adequate sleep behind them. The practical application of this is blunt and unsexy and almost insultingly simple. Getting adequate sleep is not self-indulgence. It is the primary maintenance requirement of the system you are trying to improve. The ambitious professional who sleeps 5 hours to get more done is not, in the domain of emotional mastery, working harder. They are making every aspect of the work harder. The person who is serious about emotional regulation treats sleep as a non-negotiable infrastructure investment rather than as a luxury to be earned through sufficient productivity. Nutrition operates on the same principle but through a different mechanism. Blood glucose stability, the degree to which your brain has consistent access to its primary fuel source throughout the day, directly influences prefrontal cortical function and therefore emotional regulatory capacity. The well-documented phenomenon colloquially called being hangry is not a personality quirk or an excuse for bad behavior. It is the predictable consequence of a blood glucose drop that has temporarily reduced the prefrontal cortex's capacity to modulate the amygdala's threat responses. The irritability, the shortened patience, the disproportionate reaction to minor friction. These are not choices in any meaningful sense when blood glucose has dropped below the threshold the regulatory system requires. The practical implication is not a specific diet. It is the recognition that stable blood sugar, achieved through regular meals with adequate protein and complex carbohydrates and the avoidance of the spike and crash cycle generated by refined sugar and excessive caffeine, is a direct support for emotional regulation capacity. What you eat, and when you eat, it is not separate from how you manage your emotional responses. It is one of its primary determinants. Exercise deserves particular attention here, because its effects on emotional regulation operate through multiple distinct mechanisms, not all of which are well understood by people who exercise primarily for physical fitness. Acute aerobic exercise, a single session of 30 to 40 minutes at moderate intensity, has measurable and immediate effects on mood and emotional reactivity that last for several hours after the session ends. These effects are mediated partly through the release of endorphins and partly through the elevation of monoamine neurotransmitters, including serotonin and dopamine, that directly influence the affective tone of experience. But there is also a third mechanism that is particularly relevant to the work of this book. Aerobic exercise provides a controlled context in which the body practices the physiological arousal associated with stress, elevated heart rate, elevated cortisol, elevated sympathetic nervous system activation, and then recovers from it, repeatedly, systematically. This practice of arousal and recovery appears to train the autonomic nervous system to be more efficient at the recovery phase, to return more quickly from high activation states to baseline, which means that people who exercise regularly not only feel better in general, they show measurably faster physiological recovery from emotional activation events. Their stress response, when activated, peaks at a similar level but subsides more quickly. The window in which the hijack has full control is shorter. The return to regulatory capacity is faster. This is not a peripheral benefit of exercise. For the purposes of emotional mastery, it is arguably the central one. The final element of energy architecture that requires direct address is chronic stress load, the accumulated background level of physiological activation that is carried through daily life as an undifferentiated, often barely noticed hum of low-grade threat response. Chronic stress is the most pervasive enemy of emotional regulatory capacity, and it is pervasive precisely because it is so effectively normalized. The person who has been running at elevated stress for months or years often does not experience it as stress. They experience it as their baseline, as the way things are, as the default texture of adult life. This normalization is dangerous because chronic stress continuously degrades the prefrontal cortex's structural capacity for regulatory function. The research on this is unambiguous. Prolonged cortisol exposure literally reduces gray matter density in the prefrontal cortex while increasing the size and reactivity of the amygdala. The brain physically reorganizes itself in the direction of reactivity when chronic stress is unaddressed. The techniques in this book become harder to execute, not because of insufficient will or insufficient understanding, but because the neurological substrate on which they depend is being actively eroded by the biochemistry of sustained stress. Managing chronic stress is therefore not a quality of life consideration. It is a prerequisite for sustained emotional mastery, and managing it requires taking seriously the activities that the research consistently identifies as the most effective regulators of the stress response over time: adequate sleep, already addressed. Regular aerobic exercise, already addressed. Social connection of a genuine, non-performative kind. Regular engagement with activities that produce what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called flow, the state of complete absorption in a challenging and meaningful activity that simultaneously occupies the cognitive system fully and quiets the default mode network's tendency toward rumination, and, for many people, some form of contemplative practice. Contemplative practice deserves specific mention because it is the subject of more both enthusiasm and skepticism than almost any other recommendation in the personal development space, and neither the enthusiasm nor the skepticism is well calibrated to the actual evidence. The evidence, which by now includes hundreds of controlled studies and a substantial body of neuroimaging research, is consistent on this point. Regular practice of attentional training, whether through the framework of mindfulness meditation, contemplative prayer, focused breathing practice, or any other structured method that involves deliberately directing and sustaining attention, produces measurable changes in the structure and function of the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala that are directly relevant to emotional regulatory capacity. These changes include increased gray matter density in prefrontal regions associated with executive control, decreased amygdala reactivity to emotional stimuli, faster recovery from emotional activation events, and improved performance on measures of attentional control and cognitive flexibility. They are not dramatic after a single session. They accumulate over weeks and months of consistent practice. They are, in every meaningful sense, the neurological expression of the same kind of capacity building that physical training produces in the body. None of this requires a particular philosophical framework or spiritual commitment. It requires only the recognition that deliberate, regular practice of sustained attention is a training stimulus for the system you are working to improve, and that without it, without some structured form of regular engagement with your own internal states, the techniques of emotional regulation remain skills you are applying from the outside rather than capacities that are being built into the structure of how your brain works. The body is not the context for emotional mastery. It is the medium of it, and the degree to which you invest in its maintenance is the degree to which everything else in this book becomes not just possible, but sustainable. The identity shift. When emotional mastery becomes who you are, there is a specific moment in the development of any deep skill when the relationship between you and the skill changes fundamentally. It is not the moment when the skill first works. That moment is exciting but still tentative. The first time the pause protocol actually held, the first time you caught the story machine before it completed its narrative, the first time you walked out of a family dinner having been genuinely yourself, rather than a reactive echo of the system you walked into. These are real and meaningful moments, and they deserve to be recognized as such. The moment I am pointing at is different. It is the moment when the skill stops being something you do and becomes something you are. When the pause is not an intervention you execute but a space that simply exists in you, reliably, between every activation and its expression. When the alternative story is not a technique you apply, but the natural movement of a mind that has been trained to hold its first interpretation loosely. When detachment is not a practice session you schedule but the actual quality of your relationship with outcomes. Genuinely open, genuinely unclinging, not because you have reminded yourself to be, but because the architecture of how you hold things has been rebuilt through repetition into something structurally different from what it was. This is the identity shift, and it is worth understanding clearly what it is and what it is not, because the misunderstanding of it produces either the performance of a false calm that is really suppression, or the despair of someone who has been practicing sincerely for months and cannot understand why they still get activated. The identity shift is not the elimination of activation. You are a biological organism with a threat detection system that was installed over millions of years of evolutionary pressure and has been refined by your specific history of experiences. That system is not going to stop firing. The amygdala is not going to become quiescent. The stress hormones are not going to stop releasing in response to perceived threat. The identity shift is not the absence of these responses. It is the change in what happens after they begin. The person who has not undergone the identity shift experiences the activation as the beginning of a process that will proceed without their meaningful participation, an ignition that automatically becomes a full fire, a first word that automatically becomes an argument, an initial sting that automatically becomes a narrative of grievance and counter-narrative of justification and the slow accumulation of interpersonal damage. They are, in these moments downstream of their own biology. The person who has undergone the identity shift experiences the activation as information, vivid, physical, real, sometimes intense, and experiences it in a body that has been trained to recognize it as information rather than as instruction. The activation arrives, the physiological signatures appear, and then, not after a moment of heroic effort, not through the strained application of a remembered technique, but automatically, because that is how the rebuilt neural architecture responds. The system opens into choice rather than closing into reaction. The breath is already there. The label is already forming. The slightly wider field of attention is already available. Not because you are trying, because this is now through practice and repetition what your nervous system does. This is not mysticism, it is neuroplasticity, the brain's documented capacity to reorganize its own functional architecture in response to repeated experience. Every time you have caught the story machine and held its narrative loosely, you have strengthened a set of neural connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala that researchers call top-down regulatory pathways. Every time you have used the 6-second intervention successfully, you have reinforced the habit loop in which that specific sequence, the arousal cue, the breath label redirect routine, the reward of having held your center, runs with a little more automaticity and a little less conscious effort. You have been, through every iteration of every practice in this book, literally building the brain of a person who responds differently to the world. The identity shift is when you notice that you have already built it, that the rebuilt version is not a future self you are working toward, but a present self that is already, in most circumstances, the person this book has been describing. Not perfectly, not in every circumstance, the most. Activating situations will still require conscious engagement, and the most personal wounds will still arrive with a particular force that demands the most from your regulatory capacity, but as a default, as the shape of the day rather than the exception within it. The practical markers of the identity shift are quiet, but unmistakable once you know what to look for. The situation that would have cost you 3 days of rumination now costs you an afternoon, then an hour, then the time it takes to recognize it and release it. The comment that would have generated a defensive response now arrives and is processed and responded to from a place that feels, genuinely, like solid ground rather than threatened territory. The family system that would have reliably retrieved the younger version of you now activates that version briefly, transparently, and then, because you can see it happening, fails to maintain it. You notice the pattern, and you return, not to performance, to yourself. The relationship you develop with difficult people also changes as the identity shift takes hold. Not because difficult people become less difficult, they are who they are, running the patterns they run, for reasons that have nothing to do with your development, but because the quality of your attention to them changes. The territorial aggressor becomes genuinely interesting as a study in how threat management systems develop. The indirect saboteur becomes a puzzle about the relationship between early experience and current communication style. The crisis architect becomes a case study in how attachment strategies form and persist. None of this is clinical detachment or manufactured warmth. It is the natural movement of a mind that is no longer primarily monitoring for personal threat, and has therefore freed up significant cognitive bandwidth for genuine curiosity about the human beings it encounters. This curiosity is one of the more unexpected gifts of the identity shift. People who have done this work often report that their experience of other people changes in a way they didn't fully anticipate, that the world becomes, in a specific sense, more interesting as it becomes less threatening, that the person who once triggered instant defensiveness now triggers something closer to fascination, a genuine interest in what their behavior reveals about them, about the particular way this particular nervous system was shaped by this particular history. This is not the distant interest of someone who has stopped caring. It is the engaged curiosity of someone who is no longer primarily defending. There is one final thing about the identity shift that deserves to be stated plainly, because it is both counterintuitive and important. It does not make you invulnerable. It makes you resilient. These are different things. Invulnerability is the absence of impact. The closed system that registers nothing, feels nothing, is moved by nothing. It is also impossible for any human being who is genuinely alive to their own experience. Resilience is the capacity to be impacted and to return, to feel the full weight of a difficult experience and then, without undue delay, without extended colonization of your inner life, to come back to center, to be moved without being swept away, to care without being consumed, to feel the fire without catching it. The person you become through this work is not a person who is never bothered. It is a person who is bothered briefly, cleanly, and with full awareness, and who then, because the recovery pathway is built and familiar and well-traveled, returns to themselves. That return is not a performance. It is not the suppression of feeling. It is the natural completion of a cycle. Activation, recognition, regulation, return. A cycle that once took days to complete now takes minutes. That once felt like drowning now feels like weather. Present, real, sometimes intense, and then passing. Because the sky behind it was always clear, and the sky is what you are. The unfinished fight, living free in a world that will always push back. You are going to get the parking spot taken again. Not that exact scenario, necessarily, though it might be that exact scenario, because the world contains an inexhaustible supply of strangers with different ideas about whose turn it is. But something equivalent, something that arrives without warning, that activates the system, that tests everything this book has given you in a moment when you did not schedule a test, and then something after that, and something after that. This is not pessimism. It is the actual nature of a human life lived among other human beings, which is the only kind of human life available. The world is not going to become more considerate because you have become more regulated. Other people's nervous systems are not going to recalibrate themselves in response to your growth. The structural pressures that generate stress, the social dynamics that produce difficult behavior, the random and indifferent friction of daily existence, none of these will diminish. If anything, as your sensitivity to your own internal state increases through practice, you will become more aware of the moments of activation, not less. The triggers will not disappear. What will change is what they do to you, and for how long, and whether they get to write the story. This is the thing I want to leave you with, because it is the thing I had to learn the hardest way. The goal is not to arrive at a place where nothing gets in. The goal is to become someone who can let things through, fully, without armor, without managed distance, and who still comes back to themselves on the other side. The man in the parking lot, the one whose shrug colonized 3 days of my life. I have thought about him many times in the years since, not with residual anger, not with the rehearsed confrontations of that first afternoon. I have thought about him because he is the most honest emblem I have of what it looks like to be at the mercy of a world that does not know it has you. He was living his life. He took a spot. He shrugged because he was already thinking about something else. And for 3 days I walked around inside an injury he did not know he had inflicted, carrying fire that was never mine, running a story that had no relationship to what actually happened. What I understand now, and what I could not have understood then, is that the 3 days of suffering were not caused by him. They were caused by a system inside me that had been running without examination for 34 years, a system that said that small moments of disrespect were evidence of something large and dangerous, that the behavior of strangers was meaningful data about my worth, that the only proportionate response to feeling dismissed was the sustained and painful maintenance of that feeling until something or someone resolved it from the outside. The work of this book is the dismantling of that system, not the elimination of feeling. Feeling is what makes you human, and its elimination would be a loss of everything this work is meant to protect. The dismantling of the automaticity, the interruption of the loops that run without your consent and produce suffering without your intention, the replacement of the default reactive architecture with something you have chosen, built, practiced, and over time made your own. It is unfinished work. It will always be unfinished work. There is no final chapter to emotional mastery in the sense of a destination arrived at and secured. There are better and better seasons of practice. There are longer and longer stretches in which the default is regulation rather than reactivity, in which the return to center is faster and less costly, in which the borrowed fire is recognized and released before it has time to burn. And there are still moments, will always still be moments, when something reaches through the practice and lands on something old and real and briefly has you. Those moments are not failures. They are the ongoing proof that you are genuinely in contact with your own life. The person who is never moved was never truly present. The person who is moved and returns is doing the actual work. There is a phrase from the Stoic tradition that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else I have encountered in this area of work. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in the small hours of what was arguably the most stressful life in the ancient world, recorded this: "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The strength he was describing is not the strength of the person who is unaffected. It is the strength of the person who, having been affected, knows exactly where they are, exactly what is happening, and exactly what to do with it. It is the strength that comes not from having built walls, but from having built, through practice and intention, and the accumulated experience of returning to yourself over and over across thousands of small moments, an actual center, a place in yourself that is genuinely yours, that other people's behavior can reach but cannot relocate, that circumstances can press against but cannot collapse, that the parking lot stranger and the difficult colleague and the activating family member can all visit without any of them getting to stay. That is the place this book has been pointing toward. Not because I arrived there once and can tell you what it looks like from the other side, but because I have been finding my way back to it, every time I leave it, for years, and every return is easier than the last. Not because the world has changed, but because I have. You will too. Not perfectly, not permanently, not without the occasional cracked molar and 11 minutes in a parking lot with the clock running on the dashboard. But you will. The choice is available to you right now, in this moment exactly as you are. Make it, practice it, lose it and find it again. This is the work, and it is, without question, the most worthwhile thing you will ever do.